Today, we're going to give a 30-minute summary of the entire history of philosophy. And if you are ever sort of pushed on your heels by somebody name-dropping a particular philosopher and you're not sure how to understand them, I'll tell you what, once you understand this summary and you can memorize this story of philosophy, no matter what name anybody drops at you, even if you've never heard them before, I'm going to give you a story within which you can locate that person so that you're never going to be caught off guard again. You're going to know the entire history of philosophy, how to make sense of it, and how to locate any philosopher that you come across, no matter who they are. I'm often very intimidated by philosophical knowledge, okay? People will name drop philosophers and ideas with such fluency. I often kind of feel like an idiot, right? They'll start talking about Schopenhauer and I'll be like, right? And even after teaching philosophy at a college level for years, I'm still kind of insecure about my philosophical knowledge. But one thing that has always succeeded in making sense of very unknown figures in philosophy is my basic conception of the story of philosophy. And it is a very simple story and can be explained without footnotes or block quotes. And if you can memorize this simple story, which is constituted basically by 6 words, you will be able to locate and sort of plug and play any unknown or obscure philosopher. Now, there are 3 fundamental categories of philosophy, which are these categories, and they constitute 6 of the essential words that you need to understand basically the entire story of philosophy. And these categories are this: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Now, what are these words? Every single philosophical concept falls within these 3 domains, or somehow relates these 3 words to one another. So, metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. So if physics studies what is true of the material world, then metaphysics is a way of describing the immaterial world, which gives shape and order to the material world. So for example, the claim that the soul exists is a metaphysical claim. And more basically, the claim that the world exists according to the laws of logic, that's a metaphysical claim. Metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. So it explains not merely the material, but the conditions in which a material world could exist. So that's metaphysics. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Epistemology is the study of what we can know, how we can know things, and right and wrong ways of knowing. So for example, logic and evidence are 2 kinds of epistemology. If you combine them together, you get the scientific method. So the charge, if someone says to you, you're being irrational, that's an epistemological accusation. So atheism is a metaphysical claim, right? God doesn't exist. Whereas agnosticism it's an epistemological claim, which is that we can't know that God exists. Okay, so that's how you kind of slice the pie between metaphysics and epistemology with reference to the question of God. So metaphysics is ultimate reality. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Axiology is the study of value. So within axiology falls subdisciplines like aesthetics, which is the study of beauty and ugliness, and ethics, which is the study of right and wrong. And unlike metaphysics and epistemology, which are black and white categories, axiological realities can be measured in degree. So a metaphysical claim, such as the claim, the soul exists, is either true or it's not. The epistemological claim, you have committed a logical fallacy, is either true or it's not. Whereas the axiological claim, this painting is beautiful, or you should have done better, are statements of relativity and statements of degree. So every single philosophical idea is either metaphysical, epistemological, or axiological, or relates those 3 somehow. So those are the first 3 words: metaphysics, the study of ultimate reality; epistemology, the study of how we know what we know, the study of knowledge; and axiology, the study of value, including aesthetics, which is the study of beauty and ugliness, and ethics, which is the study of right and wrong. Now, the second set of 3 words, which constitutes the 6 basic words of the story of philosophy, are premodernism, modernism, and postmodernism. And these are 3 ways of relating metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Premodernism begins all philosophical thought with metaphysical claims. That's what premodernism is. It's a kind of worldview. It's a category of worldview. So multiple worldviews would fall within premodernism. There are multiple premodern worldviews to believe. And epistemology was determined by the premoderns by the nature of metaphysical reality. So for example, the first philosophers, the pre-Socratics, who came right before Socrates, pre-Socratics, in the 7th and 6th century BC, they made very elemental claims about the world, like all is water, all is fire. And what they meant by statements like this was something metaphysical, right? They didn't mean that we're literally all on fire right now. What they meant was in the same way that fire is a flux, the whole world is a flux, and change is real and order is an illusion, right? And the pre-Socratics were composed of basically two schools, the Eleatics and the Milesians. And the Milesians emphasized the disorder and the chaos of the world, and the Eleatics emphasized the orderliness and oneness of the world. So accordingly, the Milesians, because they saw the metaphysics of the world as chaotic, they emphasized sense experience as the proper epistemology, whereas the Eleatics emphasized the orderliness of the world, even to the point of rejecting that change was real at all. And they saw reason as the proper epistemology, as opposed to sense experience. So the Milesian philosophy emphasized change, or metabole was essentially what their philosophy was about. The world was in metabole, was in change. And the Eleatic philosophy emphasized unity, or logos, so metabole versus logos. And Socrates then came on the scene and taught the world to ask bigger, better questions about reality. So instead of asking, what is the right thing to do, a philosopher should ask, what is goodness? What is rightness? And in a sense, Socrates taught the world to think meta about realities. So to conceive of the immaterial realities behind our operational use of certain concepts. So Socrates pushed for conceptions of important realities that could be justified and universally applied without exception. So Socrates' student, Plato, took this notion of thinking meta and applied it to the entire world. His claim, kind of in line with the Eleatics, was that the material world was less real than the ideal world. In fact, it was the only world of ideas which was actually real. So the material world was just a shadow of the ideal world, since ideas are incorruptible and unchangeable and fixed, while the material world fades and disappears. And Plato called these ideas forms and defended the notion that we must access this world of forms through reason, through thinking of them, through conceiving of them in our minds, and that right reasoning was the necessary path to live in the real world. Plato's student Aristotle argued against Plato. So Aristotle argued that forms, or morphe, as Plato called them, using the Greek word morphe, forms don't exist in some separate reality, but they exist in the material things themselves. So in other words, the metaphysical world isn't just up there, it's actually down here. It's actually in the things. Things themselves are metaphysical rather than being shadows of the metaphysical. So take, for example, the metaphysics of a human being. Is the substance of a human being, is it an abstract idea to which human beings conform? That a human needs to conform himself to through reason? Or is it an intrinsic potential that he needs to fulfill in order to be his best self? So Plato would say that the idea human being is a form to which humans should conform themselves, whereas Aristotle would say that a human being is a substance that contains both form and matter, which dictates proper action in order to fulfill its maximum potential. So Aristotle's metaphysical shift changed the way he viewed ethics. So acting ethically for Aristotle was not conceived in terms of conforming yourself to some abstract form of justice like Socrates and Plato argued. Instead, for Aristotle, ethics was conceived as a balanced expression of certain virtues which were inherently fitting to human nature. So, for example, take the act of facing danger, right? If you shy away from danger, you're a coward, which is a vice. But if you always rush headlong into danger without thinking tactically or strategically, well, that's foolishness too. But if you, so you have cowardice on one side and foolishness on the other side, or foolhardiness. But if you tactfully and strategically engage danger, not shying away or rushing in, that is a balance and therefore is a virtue. Okay, so it's not, so Aristotle, because he believed that metaphysics resided in the person, it was a different way of governing why people should act rightly. Rather than conforming yourself to an abstract idea, you fulfill what is right in a balanced way. And Christianity was heavily Platonic at its birth because the Platonic notions of abstract forms correlated well with the Judeo-Christian speech about like the incorruptibility of the divine essence and things like that. There was a happy marriage between Neoplatonism and Christianity, and Platonic language served the early Christology debates very well as it sought to articulate a balanced Christology. And it was through Augustine that Plato became the ruling architecture of Christian doctrine for the next millennium. In the same way that Plato really emphasized the oneness of the world, the order of the world, Augustine emphasized the oneness of the Trinity over the threeness of the Trinity, and so on and so forth. There were multiple other similarities. A millennium later, Aristotle made its way back into the West after his writings had been preserved by Islamism, actually. And philosopher Thomas Aquinas most popularly used Aristotle as a framework for articulating Christianity, and the sophistication of Aristotle's conception of substance, which we talked about earlier as being in the object rather than a form up there in the world, allowed Christian doctrine to exit the realm of abstraction and begin making more sophisticated formulations about the spirituality and materiality of Christianity, which is why Aristotle gave birth to a whole conversation about sacramentology, because you're really trying to account for the coexistence of the spiritual and the material in the same place, in the same substance, right? So all of these philosophers have in common a pre-modern architecture, all the way from the pre-Socratics through to Socrates, to Plato, to Aristotle, to the early church, and up to Thomas Aquinas. They are all pre-moderns because the first thing they do is posit the nature of the metaphysical world, and afterward, they ask how epistemology conforms to that metaphysics. Then we move from pre-modernism to modernism. Modernism prioritizes epistemology over metaphysics. This is called in history, this moment or this event in philosophical history is called the epistemic shift, because it changes from prioritizing metaphysics as the bottom to epistemology. Instead, it flips it, puts epistemology underneath and before metaphysics. And this epistemic shift is sometimes historically called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment being defined as thinking for oneself rather than speculating about substances and forms. And modernism, in the form of the Enlightenment, is when philosophy really started thinking primarily about method, not so much about ultimate reality. So this epistemic shift occurred first in the philosopher René Descartes in the 17th century, who doubted all metaphysical knowledge. He asked, what happens if we doubt everything? That's the only way we can be certain of anything, is to mercilessly prosecute and doubt every single thing. And then what's the end of this doubt? Well, a simple proof that even doubt is a thought, Descartes reasoned, that even doubt is a thought, which means that even if you doubt everything, you're still thinking, which means that the act of thinking can't be doubted. Therefore, the human mind exists at the foundation of doubt. And he uses logic to construct an entire philosophical edifice without any religious or metaphysical speculation of pre-modernism, right? So if the pre-moderns conceived the world in terms of the phrase, I am, which is a metaphysical claim, therefore, I think, which is thinking is an epistemological act. So the pre-modern conception of the human being would have said, I am, therefore I think. And it was Descartes who flipped everything through the epistemic shift, right? And he said instead, not I am, therefore I think, but I think, therefore I am, because thinking is the proof of itself. Then along comes David Hume, an 18th century philosopher, and he took Descartes' radical doubt to the next level. So he made an important distinction between impressions and ideas. Impressions are experiences of the world. So if I see an 8-ball on a pool table, and that 8-ball makes an impression on my mind because I see it. So if I see a cue ball on that same table, that cue ball makes a separate impression on my mind. If I see someone hit the cue ball into the 8-ball, and I witness the 8-ball move, Hume argues that I impose the idea of causality onto the relationship between the cue ball and the 8-ball. So in Hume's view, I am justified to believe that the cue ball and the 8-ball are real because they've made direct impressions on my mind. But I am not justified in saying that I know the cue ball caused the 8-ball to move, because causality isn't an object in the world, so it can't make an impression on my mind. And we're only justified in knowing, in our knowing of things which make impressions on our mind. We only impressed knowledge is certain knowledge, or can be certain knowledge. So Hume also classified morality as an idea rather than an impression, and infamously declared, is doesn't entail ought. You can't get from is to ought. You can't get from metaphysics to ethics. You just can't do it. There's no metaphysical claim that entails a certain ethical action. So in other words, you can't deduce any binding moral concepts from the bare material world. And Descartes' philosophy is called rationalism because he builds an entire worldview based on a modernist conception of reason, meaning that reason as a way of knowing is the foundation of all justified knowledge. Hume's philosophy is called empiricism, not rationalism, empiricism, because he builds an entire worldview based on a modernist conception of experience, meaning that experience as a way of knowing is the foundation of all justified knowledge. Then comes in a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, several decades after Hume, and Kant attempted to reconcile Descartes' rationalism and Hume's skepticism. So Kant argued that we need to make a distinction between what he called the noumenal realm and the phenomenal realm. The noumenal world represents the world as it really is, the world of ideas in Descartes, right? And the phenomenal world represents the world as it exists in our perception, so the world of impressions in Hume. So if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to witness it, did anything happen? Nominally speaking, yes it did. Phenomenally speaking, no it did not. And we only have access to the phenomenal world. But there is a mechanism in our mind called the transcendental, which translates the noumenal realm for us and displays the phenomenal world in our perception like a movie projector, right? To use another metaphor, think of the transcendental operating in your mind, which Kant translates the noumenal to the phenomenal for us. Think of it like a sausage maker. So imagine the noumenal world is the raw material of sausage, and the phenomenal world is the processed, packaged sausage link. Now imagine you go to a grocery store and you read on the label that the sausage is made of the highest quality pork and it's organic, right? So you try to visit the sausage factory to verify that the sausage is organic and that all the materials are high quality, but they won't let you in for security reasons, for sanitary reasons, right? And that seems understandable to you. Why would they let some rando walk into their sausage factory, right? So you decide, I'm just going to trust the sausage company. Kant argues that we need to take the same posture toward the transcendental. We will never have justified knowledge of the world as it really is. We'll never be able to escape our mind. We can never make it to the sausage factory to visit, to verify whether our experience of the world conforms to the actual world. All we have is our experience. And in that sense, Hume's critique of Descartes is correct, since all we have are sense experiences. But we should trust that the transcendental gives to us in the form of the phenomenal world what is practically true, and therefore, while we may not be epistemologically justified in assuming that our claims about the phenomenal world translate to the noumenal, we are practically justified in assuming that the laws of logic can establish common rules of perception that govern everyone's mind and therefore work as common rules which human beings are justified in taking for granted. So Kant likewise attempts to rectify Hume's moral crisis of saying you can't move from is to ought by proposing what he calls the categorical imperative, which is the notion that a moral law is binding if it can be universalized. So, for example, lying or not telling the truth, right, purposely, to deceiving other people is categorically wrong because if everybody lied all the time, there would be no such thing as truth-telling and therefore no such thing as lying. So therefore, lying should be morally wrong because to universalize it would be to destroy the possibility of the concept itself. Same thing for adultery and murder and even homosexuality, Kantian arguments have been made. And then comes along philosopher Georg Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, who came in the 19th century to critique Kant. And his basic critique is that Kant's noumenal-phenomenal distinction doesn't actually solve the disagreement between Descartes and Hume, but actually fortifies the tension and is even more problematic for us. It traps people in the phenomenal and locks them out of any justified knowledge of the noumenal world or the real world. So, Hegel argued that ultimate reality makes itself known to the world through rationality. But the way it makes itself known is unique to Hegel. Okay, so Hegel argues that rationality ushers the noumenal world into our world progressively through dialectic. What does that mean? What this means is that one generation of humankind may hold to a particular idea. That idea could be called a thesis about the way the world works. Then the next generation rebels and comes up with like an opposing idea, right? And that idea is called the antithesis. So you have the thesis from the first generation, the antithesis from the second generation. Then the third generation rebels against the second generation and combines the strengths of both theses into a synthesis. So you've got thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. Then the fourth generation rebels against the third generation, and the third generation synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the fourth generation proposes an antithesis. Then the fifth generation rebels against the fourth generation and proposes a new synthesis, and so on. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and that is called a dialectic, and so on and so forth, right? This is called in Hegel the rational dialectic. Pure reason, in a sense, is a future reality that is pulling us toward itself through the dialectic like a black hole. Reason is inevitable. The dialectic is pushing us forward. It is propelling us to a place and time in history before us, in front of us, prospectively, that will be perfectly reasonable. And the human race is becoming inevitably and unstoppably more reasonable. And it is through reason that the world will be saved. And all individuals will, on the last day, think the same way and have the same perspective and hold the same opinions. then the noumenal and the phenomenal worlds will be identical. However, we must resist the notion that we are perfectly reasonable today, according to Hegel, because to suggest that we are dogmatically correct today is to fall into the trap of believing that no antithesis will come, that our beliefs will never be falsified, which is to fall into the error of the pre-moderns in Hegel's view. So Hegel thought Christianity is the most rational expression of the noumenal realm today, and for that reason ought to be believed, so we should all be Christians, but we must hold in principle that it will be overcome and antithesized in the future, and therefore ought to be held in an open hand. So Hegel thought that the human race was born in a religious state. That was the first thesis, and was liberated from that state through objective ethical thinking, and will one day be rescued from merely ethical thinking into a bliss of pure aesthetic enjoyment through the rational dialectic. So he's saying all the human race began in this religious state, moved to ethical, and is moving to is moving to aesthetic. So it goes from religious to ethical to aesthetic. Not only is that the biography of the human race, it is the biography of each man. And the way that he enlightens himself, the way he liberates himself, is to liberate himself from the religious through ethical thinking, and to liberate himself through the ethical thinking into aesthetic thinking. And the reason that the aesthetic no longer requires ethics is because when everybody thinks the same way, ethics won't be required. Reason will bring us all together. And in this way, Hegel saw the world unfolding in three acts as the path every man ought to journey for himself. He is born stupid and religious and grows into an ethical state, and through reason learns to achieve existential bliss. And Hegel gave birth to two movements: his defenders and his detractors. And his defenders believed that the world ought to move in a more homogeneous direction in which all individuals eventually meld into a single perspective, where everything is the same and individuality is not important. And obviously Hegel is in this way the root of Marxism. Detracting from Hegel are those who thought that individuality was the essence of rationality, and to be an individual was the irreducible element of being reasonable. And in that sense, Hegel's detractors conceived Hegel as the opposite of rationality. And this detraction was represented most famously by Søren Kierkegaard, who argued that Hegel had the three acts of the world and of the human life exactly backwards, in the exact opposite order. So Kierkegaard argued that aesthetic enjoyment is not the sophisticated highest tier of human existence, but is rather the mental state of the infant, kind of drooling, blissful and aesthetic bliss, right? According to his own mind, he's correct, right? Then man exits the aesthetic infantile stage of his life and enters the ethical. And then he achieves the highest tier, the religious mode of existence, which is not the infantile stage as Hegel proposes, but the most sophisticated stage is the religious mode of existence, which is a man's authentic encounter with God as an individual, right? And in that state, in the religious state, he recognizes that God has the right to do whatever he wants with him. It is only in this state of individuality, which Kierkegaard calls authenticity, that a man can be reasonable and ethical and properly celebrate the true beauty of the world as that to which he is not entitled. And in this existential age, one ethical entailment is that moral principles have been relativized. And in the rejection of Kant through Hegelianism, Hume's dictum, "You can't get from is to ought," haunted the world, and the human race pondered the potential consequences of a modernist view of the world that couldn't justify a universal conception of the good as Socrates had defended thousands of years earlier. So we moved from pre-modernism, which is a way of looking at the world that prioritizes metaphysics, to modernism, which is a way of looking at the world that prioritizes epistemology, now to postmodernism. And postmodernism front-loads not the metaphysical or epistemological, but the axiological. Okay? And postmodernism was rooted in Hegelian existentialism, but was jolted into existence by the Holocaust. And many philosophers, such as Emanuel Levinas and Martin Buber, saw the Nazi Party as representative of the inevitable consequence of the Enlightenment. They philosophized that modernism's inability to see metaphysical realities, their disenchantment with the world, allowed the Nazis to dehumanize the Jews, because the Nazis were slave to a myth of rationality that was in reality a way of masking their attempt to gain political power. It is the entailment of losing sight of the noumenal realm altogether, which is a product of Kantianism. So, philosophy had two options in the 21st century to prevent another Holocaust: to go back to pre-modernism and give human beings dignity through acknowledging their metaphysical value, such as the soul, or abandon metaphysics entirely and front-load axiology, that is, front-load one's ethical responsibility to one's neighbor and to pursue global justice. Then, epistemology simply becomes a tool in defending and fortifying that pursuit of justice. And in this way, postmodernism is always on the hunt for the agenda behind truth claims. Postmodernism sees any claim to objective truth as a veiled attempt to gain power over another human being by persuading them to submit to their way of seeing the world, because again, world after Kant, there's no such thing in the as the noumenal. All we have is perception. Therefore, all we have to protect those around us is to front load the human dignity of each person with no metaphysical basis, to front load your ethical obligation to equity, to perfect global equity, and then to make sense of the world after the fact. And we must recognize here that postmodernism did not originate the claim that we do not have access to objective truth. That was Kant, who fortified the distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. And all that needed to occur for the relationship between those worlds to be broken is for some event to occur which casts enough suspicion on the transcendental that Kant posited to distrust it, to distrust the sausage maker. And that event was the Holocaust. And once you're stuck in the phenomenal world with no trustworthy transcendental to mediate the noumenal world to you, and people are acting as if human dignity doesn't exist, you're stuck with subjectivity and an ethical absolute. And in this way, the task of philosophy becomes the establishment of global justice, not because people were eager to abandon truth, but because through Descartes, Hume, and Kant, people became blind to metaphysics and therefore blind to the necessary theological foundations which exist at the very bottom of every philosophical question. And postmodernism is not an eager pursuit of relativism, although maybe it has become that in some circles, but a desperate scramble to minimize the ethical damages that secularism has wreaked on the world through an unchecked Enlightenment modernism. And today, we exist not so much in a postmodern age, but in an age of competing modernities. People don't know how to become enchanted with the metaphysical world again, even though they want to. People are grasping towards something more than materialism, but they can't attain it because the structure of modernity requires them to begin with epistemology, which or even worse, a postmodernity, which requires them to front load and begin with an unjustified axiology, which dictates a principle of radical doubt, which will never allow the justification of metaphysics ever. So what direction should we go? How can we become enchanted with the world again? Should we not all just become pre-Socratics again and start from scratch and start claiming all is fire, all is water? Certainly not. As the Judeo-Christian worldview emphasizes, the only way to begin with metaphysics is not to speculate about the metaphysical world, but to have the metaphysical world actually reach out to you. And Christians have historically called this metaphysical point of contact revelation. God actually deigns to reach down into the material world and manifest himself to those who will accept his self-witness. And much more could be said about the relationship between philosophy and theology, and the complex ways that philosophy has bearing upon our cultural moment. But for the purpose of keeping the summary as short as possible, the doctrine of revelation is as good a place as any to conclude this comprehensive survey of the entire history of philosophy. There you go.